To introduce the subject of punctuation, I'd like to just talk about our attitude towards punctuation. And I think often what happens is that we have a sort of conflicted attitude, because on the one hand we laugh at punctuation mistakes, but we often don't actually take it seriously enough to really make the effort to learn what the different punctuation rules are. And we kind of fumble along intuitively and try to make some sense of it. So what I'd like to talk about is really this effort of shifting from the more comical aspects of misused punctuation to the more serious effort to really understand what's going on. And the more comical side of it is illustrated by these kinds of sayings and quotations and signs. And I think you've probably seen these kinds of things if you've looked on Facebook in the last little while, and some of your friends may have posted these kinds of things. So the first one here, if somebody says, "Let's eat dad," there should be a comma here because we don't really want to eat dad. And then the second one here is called the grocer's apostrophe, because you see it in a lot of grocery stores where we've used an apostrophe to form the plural, which is incorrect. And then the last one is this funny kind of sign that implies that the pedestrians are slippery when wet. And you can look up these things, online, and you'll see way more signs and funny sayings like this. But the trouble is, how do we get from here to actually really thinking about punctuation and how it works? So I have an example here, and what I'd like you to think about as you look at this example is that we have to make the connection between punctuation and these other parts of grammar, which are sentence structure and parts of speech. And that is really the onerous task. You need to know something about how sentence structure works, how clauses work, how phrases work. And if you haven't really mastered that, then you need to go back and study that and then come to punctuation. Okay, because otherwise it really doesn't make sense. If you can't find the subject, for instance, you're going to have a bit of a struggle with punctuation. But if you do know those things, then there is a real beauty to punctuation, because a lot of it makes complete sense. So if we look at this example, for instance, in the beginning we just wanted an adventure, in the end we just wanted to go home. We have a nice parallel structure here, and each of these parts of the sentence, separated by the semicolon here, starts with an introductory phrase, in the beginning, in the end. Okay, so we can map this out. We can say, well, this is an introductory phrase, and we're just going to put it in a box here, and then we're going to put a comma after it, and then we get an independent clause. Independent clause. And together these can form a sentence, but we can also stick a semicolon between these two, and then we repeat the same thing again. So then we have our second introductory phrase and our second independent clause. And when we do this, we can see that these things are very neatly parallel, and there's a kind of beauty to this. If we know these kinds of things, if we know that a semicolon typically connects two independent clauses that are closely linked like this, then we don't succumb to what I sometimes tend to think of as kind of the breathing theory of punctuation, which is this notion that when you write, you should just think of punctuation as the spaces where there's a pause. And if you have a longer pause, you put a semicolon, shorter pause, it's a comma, and so on. That is complete rubbish. Well, there's some truth to it because sometimes you do pause, but it's really misleading. And you end up with all these weird situations where you have semicolons that are in the wrong place, commas that are unnecessary, and that's because people haven't taken the trouble to really understand grammar, to understand sentence structure and parts of speech. But I do promise you that if you work through the sections on punctuation, you're going to see the beauty of punctuation, and it will actually have a great deal of clarity. And if you think about the different parts of the sentence as working together and punctuation as connecting those different parts, you're really going to enjoy the lessons on punctuation, and it's going to make a lot of sense.